So hello. I thought what I would do today is present the locative media app that I'm currently working on in connection with a research project I've been working on the last few years. I'm writing a book about narratives of travel and botanical exploration in South Asia, in colonial and by colonial as well as post-colonial writers. And in the course of doing that research, I spent a lot of time visiting archives that were located at botanical gardens. And when I wasn't in the archive, I would often go for a stroll in the garden, and I started thinking about how that research was really transforming my own relationship to the spaces of the gardens that I was spending a lot of time in. And I got intrigued with the idea of how I could sort of use mobile media, locative media, to help maybe disseminate some of that research in an unconventional form, move away from the monograph and think about how could I curate these garden spaces in ways that might allow me to get larger publics to engage with the research I was conducting. And of course, there are ways that gardens are trying to curate themselves. They've sort of moved from these centers of scientific research that they were born as in the colonial era towards a kind of emphasis on biodiversity and a kind of, but I think a sort of silencing of the colonial history that's part of botanical gardens. So I was curious, I wanted to think about how can I bring that other sort of way of thinking about the garden into the garden. It might involve collaborating with botanical gardens, though sometimes I'm worried that they might not be that open to the kind of more difficult knowledge that I want to try and integrate into garden spaces. The Montreal Botanical Gardens so far has been very approachable about these things, and I'm also considering proposing integrating an adaptation of the project into the Grand Métis Garden that's in Gaspé, which has spaces that my project could work in as well. So I started by prototyping the MIST guide at the NT2 lab at Figura Concordia, and I also have connections with the TAG Research Lab. Essentially, what the MIST guide, I'm playing on the idea of the guidebook, the botanical field guide, but sort of trying to disrupt the sort of didactic relationship that those information-based guides have to the spaces that they are tied to, and sort of surprise the visitor to the garden through the process of wandering through the garden to try and locate approximately 9 QR codes, which once collected and scanned, so there's a kind of narrative of botanical exploration that I've built into the installation of the project in the Alpine Garden at the Montreal Botanical Garden. It's not installed yet, but I've tested it a couple times so far, and the GPS works, so we're happy about that. So the visitor to the garden is invited to participate in this narrative of exploration. Once they sort of locate the QR codes using the GPS-enabled compass, they're sort of asked to photograph the QR code, and then they essentially capture these images of alpine specimens that are linked to sort of some of the archival information that I've been collecting in connection with my project. Things that kind of problematize the sort of narratives of botanical heroism that are associated with plant collectors in the colonial era, and which also, and that look at also how their projects and expeditions were supported by local communities, suggest ways in which those colonial narratives do have spaces in them where we can glance at alternative ways of seeing and understanding the environment. In the process of collecting the different botanical vouchers, as we call them, the visitor also accumulates a series of jigsaw puzzle pieces, which they can then assemble into an alpine landscape the point of which is to sort of remind the visitor that all of these plants come from an elsewhere. So that's the mechanics of the MIST guide. And then in the process of making the guide, I've also been looking at theories of locative media and practices of reading associated with them to try and make sense for myself. You know, how is locative media a particularly unique way of disseminating this information as opposed to just, you know, putting in didactic panels. And I'm currently working on developing a graduate course where we'll look at these ideas together and also think about the problem of studying locative media texts when they are something that generally needs to be experienced in the places in which they're created for. Thanks.